when the UNEP, I have to click something here, it won't let me move on. She has won numerous awards, the UNEP Gold Medal, the UNEP Global 500, the Earth Trustee Award, Who's Who in Environment, and my favorite is her latest, the Wondrous Women of the Coast. And she truly is a wondrous woman. She's known throughout the world as a marine biologist, an ecophysiologist, and a chemical oceanographer. And her memory, her ability to remember names and facts. I look forward to Anitra's call. She calls me about once every few weeks, and I get a huge history lesson about the world. That is just incredible. She's had an incredible, amazing influence on national and international policies. She speaks her mind, and as she told me, there is no other way to do it. So either you are part of the movement forward or you're not part of this incredible person's movement. She started the Greater Caribbean Energy and Environmental Foundation. I love the work they're doing. They have young people helping them to really work on carbon sequestration through seagrass and through protecting mangroves, and a huge amount of work that she's done on the coast. She is a full member of CORE. She got me involved in the Club of Rome when I thought it was a tourist program. She kept saying to me, you have to go to join the Club of Rome. And I thought, I wonder where we're going. And so she's also been twice US president for the USACOR, a prolific writer. Anitra's up early in the morning. She's written over 200 articles, 11 books, and always has a new one on the way. I love it because she keeps me forward thinking in areas that she's continuously working on. Just to give you a sense of the school she studied at: Smith University, Roosevelt University, University of Oslo, Rosenstahl School of Marine, and also Stanford. And again, she has her PhD in that area. She's lectured all over, from the University of California, Berkeley, Stanford, Rosenstahl School, Florida School, Yale, and she's even spoken to our students at Laurel Springs, and she was quite popular. The children just adored her. And even my grandkids, I always tell stories about her, and they're always asking, where did Anitra go today? And I'll say, oh, today she swam with the crocodiles. She's worked for the United Nations agencies, World Bank, Food and Agriculture organizations, and international oceanographic commissions. I mean, it's endless. I mean, I don't know how or if she ever sleeps. And it goes on and on. In addition, I have pages, I've studied her. Here are some thoughts about her. Here are the things that she's worked on. Permitting permits for coastal construction, coastal mitigation and rehabilitation, coastal maps, environmental impact statement, toxicity testing, studies on pollution cleanup, planning and maps. It goes on and on and on, the kind of work, and she's never ending in her focus, dedication, and absolute positive attitude that we can make this difference. In addition, and that's really only a few of the things she's done, she's a huge humanitarian. She's a humanitarian on a global level, having helped out in Haiti, and she's doing incredible work with the Leaf Schools and John McGillmore. I mean, she has a passion for humanity, for children, for education, and she cares. And she's really worked with John in ways that have been tremendous with the World Bank, and just really promoting the work he's done on healing the scars of apartheid, increasing student awareness, as well as their academic work, seeing the model and the bigger picture and everything that she has done. She also has great emotional skills. She's always sending me cards, internet cards. She's checking on my grandchildren. I mean, how she has time to check on my grandchildren. She's worried about my son's divorce. She's like, I don't know what I'd do without her. She's like an angel floating around the world. planting goodness wherever she goes. And I just so appreciate her. And now she's on to a new invention creation, which I love, which is our Voyagers pivoting to regeneration. It's such a brilliant word, regeneration of our ecosystems. And the way that we talked about it is that we're constantly regenerating. We as humans, the land, everything that is connected to nature. Why aren't we looking at regeneration of mankind, which has been degraded, can be regenerated? And so I'm so excited that for the first time, we are pivoting into a very positive, important, meaningful, and it could be life-changing approach to surviving on this planet. And I tell you that this woman is changing the world one piece of seagrass at a time. Thank you, Anitra, for who you are, what you do. And I can't wait to see what you're going to do for the next epoch of our journey.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. That was extremely lovely. Thank you. I'm very touched. Ted, could you put on the screen sharing?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Right now.
Mine says you disabled screen share. Okay. Host disabled screen sharing. No.
Shall I try again?
Leandro, you want to help me screen share?
I have to share it again. I'll have to try that.
It says host disabled screen share. I have the thing on.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see. Just give me a second.
Who's the host?
I am.
Can you see Leandro? He's from Brazil, and he's my everything. Then I'm not.
Allow, there we go. Okay. You should now have the ability to share screen.
No, that's not it.
That's not it.
That is.
It says while somebody else is sharing, I cannot share.
Okay,
Yes.
let's try again.
Yeah, other participants.
We can see now.
Advanced.
I can see a screen. I'm not sure if, I think that must be yours, Anitra.
It's somebody's, yeah, somebody's desktop.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see.
It's
It's
Just
not
need to open
mine, and I'm not anxious in, okay, if I
It's
stop
Tim.
my share. Let's,
Well, it's the clean screen.
yeah, Leandro, can you tell me the precise thing? Because it was set
This
up.
one. Yeah, that's it.
Got it?
Can
Okay,
everybody
so
see
whatever
that?
I did right, and you guys will figure out how I did that.
Perfect. Can everybody see that? I'm
Yeah,
so
we've got it.
happy.
We've got it.
Yeah. So welcome to the next step of our exploration, fellow voyageurs. Follow me.
Yeah.
By a sapphire shore, we will walk through an emerald door into the kingdom beneath the sea. Follow me. So here we are going into a brave new world under the sea. We haven't touched the sea yet.
And
But
Anitra,
here-
is that you? Are we looking at
Yes,
you?
of course, you're looking at me. Yes,
course.
and
Of course.
a bunch of people. They're other people. This was Operation Raleigh in the Bahamas. After I got my cave diving badges. All right, now all I have to do, there we go. So I'm going to talk to you about regenerations of fundamental ecosystems globally. And my good colleague, Graham Berlin at Yale, helped compose this. So it all begins at nuclear power plants throwing horrible waste heat and other things, radionuclides, into the bays in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida. And at one of the hearings, when they were closing down the waste heat, the judge had me as a witness, and he said, "Young lady, you've showed," and I was young then, maybe hard to believe, but I was very young. And he said, "You've showed how the power plants kill all the biota, but can you put it back?" So I took a huge leap, a risk. I said, Your Honor, nobody has ever done that in the world, planted under the water, but I'll try. And so that's how it all began. So here I am on absolutely barren sand where it's been killed by a long time of pollution, planting seagrass. And this is what it looks like afterwards. But the first seagrass I planted, I came back, and in the first 5 minutes, the water cleared from me, making it very murky by planting. And there was a tiny fish behind every blade of grass. And I came up out of the water and said to my colleagues, you know, I think this is going to work. So it became very magical, and it did work. And the minute the seagrass starts growing, the animals colonize free of charge. But this happens in all the restorations, in the forest restoration, the grassland, as well as the mangroves and the coral reef. So let's think about what we've been doing in the Club of Rome. So 50 years ago, 50 years ago, the limits to growth had a big emphasis on depletion of natural resources of all kinds, and showing how they all had their limits, and you could produce so much and then they would go downhill. And then there was a large international group called Our Common Future, which had a lot of Canadians. Gro Harlem Brundtland, Prime Minister of Norway, led the group, and they came out with sustainability being a compromise between the environmentalists and those who wanted to continue to deplete for fossil fuel, for mining, for forests, for a sense of things. And then from the kinds of deliberations at the UN about sustainability came mitigation. And I was asked by the World Bank to write the book on mitigation of marine resources for them. But every developed country had mitigative measures that had to be followed. But all of these are simply going toward regeneration. And if we have been able to degrade everything, is it really like Humpty Dumpty, which can't be put back together again by all the king's horses and all the king's men? Or is it something that can be put together? And I tell you from my experience of being one of the first ones who ever went under the water and put it back together again, that it can. And we've worked 50 years now on the techniques of mangroves, coral reefs, seagrass, oysters, many other things. And the foresters have worked for 125 years. So how do we change this paradigm from depletion to well-being and regeneration? How do we go from financial goals of GDP to regenerative goals of community growth for nations, communities, and individuals? Well, first of all, we have to regenerate the forests globally. And the tundra, which is in the Arctic, that's the forest of the Arctic, you might say, and the grasslands, which are in many, many countries, Argentina, Brazil, certainly North America, and all over Central Europe. But then we have to regenerate the estuaries, the fisheries, the lakes. And I'm going to tell you about how we would do this, and then what the costs, the labor, what planning, and what potential funding we could have. So when I say regeneration, I really mean regeneration. We're going to start at the highest in the Arctic, and we're going to go to the tropics. We're going to start on the high mountains. We're going to go down to deep underwater, and we're going to really think about regenerating all these key ecosystems. In the world, 15% of the original forests only remain. That means 85% has been completely decimated. And here's a map of the world's forests. And you see the blue are the boreal forests, and that Canada and the United States, and here Russia, and of course some of the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, own most of these boreal forests. And note that the Antarctic doesn't have a shelf or doesn't have attached continents, so there are no boreal in the Antarctic, only in the Arctic. And then the tropical forests are 45% of this remaining 15%. So Brazil, having the largest amount, and some of its neighboring countries, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and then we have Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and several of their neighboring all the way down to South Africa have the mother lode of forests, except between PNG, Papua New Guinea, and Thailand, Cameroon, Myanmar, here in the South Pacific, including Indonesia, the Philippines, they have the rest of it. So that's most of the forests of the world are tropical. 25%, a quarter of them are the boreal. And there are very little temperate left in the upper western North American hemisphere and in the seaboard of the American hemisphere, and very little subtropical along the Gulf of Mexico and here in southern China. So that's what's left of the world. And there's 1 acre or a half a hectare per person of the non-frozen space left for us to do everything we need to do, such as get our food, get our clothing, get our materials, live. But is this something that we can change? So here we are to see which nations have the forest. Russia Federation has by far the most, 815 million hectares. Brazil has the second most, 500 million hectares. But Canada and United States have about 660 million hectares, whereas China has about a fifth of what Russia has, 220 hectares of forest. All the other countries of the world have 1,870, which is only 46%. So if we get these 5 nations into the right mood, they can, and they have, of course, the techniques to do a lot of regeneration. Particularly Canada, the United States have spent more than 125 years regenerating things. And Brazil has huge amounts of regeneration going on right at the moment. So here's a very confusing map, and I'm sorry, but it's from FAO. All this is 2021 information from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And this shows where the 15% of the forests that are still there, what's happening to them. And there's 7% of the forests, which all of our little pictures are hiding. And and that 7% of the forest is planted and is preserved, the two kinds of things. And this is time, 1990s to 2000, 2000 to 210, 210 to 220. And the amount of natural forest is going down by 50% in that 30-year period. Whereas there's an oscillation with the planted and the regenerating preserved, and that isn't so good. But now let's look at the marine. And I invited you into the marine space, so here we are. We're in the marine space now. And these green lines are the mangroves of the world. And you notice they're only in the tropical and some subtropical area, heavily in the Western Hemisphere, in the Bight of Africa, as well as down the East Coast, as far as Durban, South Africa, a little in Sri Lanka, and a lot in Southeast Asia and Northern Queensland, and the territories in Australia, and a tiny bit goes up to Okinawa. These are the coral reefs here, the yellow dots on the satellite map of the world. and they go out into Oceania very strongly, but Southeast Asia is a major place for the coral reefs of the world, because they're, of course, only tropical, but also the Red Sea, the Arabian Gulf, and Eastern Africa, as well as some of the offshore African islands, and of course, the greater Caribbean area, including the Gulf of Mexico down to Brazil. These are preserves. Strongly protected are the green ones, especially in Oceania and a few islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And the marine preserves are the blue ones. So there's very little protected, where you see this huge amount of biota, and very little of it is protected, and it can be shown on this one map. So we need to think about preserves as well as restoration itself. But an important point for us to outreach into the world, whoops, I wanted to get that out, that toolbar out, are the values of what the terrestrial ecosystem plants and the marine ecosystem plants give to mankind. Mumfella said I shouldn't say mankind, and I said, but I mean mankind, because it's the men who have done this. Women would have put it all back together again, like darning socks or shelling beans by this time. So these are the important values and products that the ecosystems give to humanity. Oxygen production. This is very, very important. People think that God made man because it says so in Genesis, and then God made the animals so that man could use the animals. But actually, evolution teaches us that the core of the earth emerged volcanic and other kinds of uplifts, and plants vegetated that and filled the air with oxygen. And at that point, the animals were evolved, and they breathed the oxygen, and we all breathe oxygen because we're all part of the web of life. The terrestrial and marine scrub the CO2, the carbon dioxide, which we've heard so much about this week in COP26, from the air and from the water, where it's partitioned between the two, and that diminishes climate change. But the plant cycle with the animal cycle is putting oxygen into the air and water, and then scrubbing the carbon dioxide out of the air and the water. But plants also retain water in the soils. That's very important, because if you live in a desert, you know that where you have the oasis and there are a few plants, there's going to be some water there. And the ecosystems directly have been a source of food for tens of thousands, perhaps a million years, for the human species, Homo sapiens, as well as its predecessors and many, many other animals. But they produce biodiversity, which makes resilience and tolerance of many kinds of environmental changes, and they protect the soil and shoreline stabilization from just eroding away. It's interesting that animal habitat in the 1/3 of the non-frozen terrestrial habitat on the face of the terrestrial earth is used for livestock. Do you know that? Livestock, which is only servicing and producing things for human beings, for humanity. I think that's an important thing. So how do we do this? This is in Oman, and this is a mature mangrove replantation. And this is a budding mangrove plantation. This is the way corals now are being regenerated in Asia and in Florida. So this is an Asian methodology, and you take the small pieces of corals, especially after typhoons or hurricanes, and you give them a lot of CO2, hang them in the water, give them sunlight, because they have some plants inside them that help them generate, and the corals grow. Here they have shallow tables, and here's someone, a diver, who's hidden by this group of pictures on a baseline, which is made of metal, is recreating a coral reef. Frequently, these are taken onto a real coral reef and use quick setting cement and so just cement it on. And here's my lovely seagrass. These are areas that can be, these are transplants from some kind of adjacent beds that are then fixed firmly down into the sediment, which is barren here, you see. And then after 6 months, they begin to spread, begin to grow. After a year to a year and a half, they become large and much more fertile and productive. And then after 2 to 3 years, they become a seagrass bed with all the animals and all the epiphytes and other things that are in a normal bed. So the destruction and the degradation, mangroves at 6% per decade, seagrass at 7%, corals at 8%, fisheries have had 35% to date, and nobody has a good handle, but some people like Daniel Pauly from British Columbia says it's about 10% per year. Oyster reefs and endangered species such as marine turtles and manatees are being destructed at a very high level. So you see, you can't go too many years, even if you are not a mathematician, before there's very, very little, and it's getting down to the level of the terrestrial forests. Right now, there's about 50% of mangroves, seagrass, and corals, 50% left. But it'll be another 2 decades, and there'll be very, very little. So the question is, at what point are we going to take the action to pivot this and turn around and regenerate? So the extent now of the marine habitats are 150,000 kilometers of mangroves, 171 kilometers square of seagrass, 3% of the ocean floor surface. Marshes are about 22,000, much less, and partly because we don't have good numbers for South America and Australia. And as I said, fisheries are degraded by 35%. But we also have destruction and degradation of freshwater lakes and riverine habitats. Ted Manning has spent some time in China trying to get some of the freshwater lakes, which have been totally polluted and killed, back into viable conditions. So they're making services. And how much of the ocean is being polluted with the things that come down the rivers from the ecosystems that are killed, the plastics and the garbage and the sewage. And land-based wastes come down the rivers, polluting the estuaries. I'll tell you a frightening thing. The 1/3 of the animals on the planet, which are livestock, their wastes are not in any way regulated the same way that human wastes now, almost every place in the world, are regulated as they come into the surface waters and down to the ocean. But the livestock, not so. So this is a bit frightening also. Here we are with a river cleanup in Indonesia. This is the river now. After 5 intensive years, this was the original river here, just absolutely full of plastics and wastes of all kinds that were not biodegradable. And for all my North American brethren, you'll realize that here's the Great Lakes, the boundary in many places between Canada and the United States. And due to the steel mills in Cleveland and Gary, Indiana, and Chicago, and the taconite and other kind of mining here in Lake Superior, and all of the wastes from the major cities such as Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland that came out, these were in really poor shape in the 70s, 80s, but a cleanup, a major cleanup bilaterally between Canada and the United States occurred. And not only is the lamprey eel almost gone, and some of the mussels that were very harmful for the animals, but the lakes are swimmable. And in fact, Lake Superior is drinkable again, and it hasn't been that way for 100 years. So this is a success story, which many of us like to hear, the success stories of lake cleanup and river cleanup. One in Asia, one in North America. A very important question is, can we afford to let ecosystem degradation continue? Is that a good value? Is that a good thing to allow? To let the shorelines, forests, grasslands, lakes, rivers, everything we've talked about, there are opportunities abounding to pivot this and go back to regeneration of these ecosystems. What opportunities are there for grasslands, the great things that are grazed, and pastures, and what oxygen, carbon dioxide sequestering, water retention can be supplanted? So I'm calling for action the way David Pollard about a month ago called for action. And my action is to regenerate these degraded systems. How would I do it? I would begin with the hot spots, and you'd take some of each of the groups, and you'd take some of the hot spots. So what are the hot spots criteria? Well, first of all, greatest productivity, the fastest growth. That usually means in the tropics, because the tropics grows 12 months a year. And some of the others only grow 4 months a year in the boreal and 6 months a year in the temperate. The best animal recolonization, the best carbon sequestration to rapidly bring down the temperature by scrubbing all of the carbon excess out of the air, and that partitioned into the ocean water. So somebody has to sit down and prioritize the highest areas of all these things and make some kind of an equation and figure out where the important hotspots to begin. Obviously, the rainforests of Brazil, the rainforests of Africa, 2 of the hotspots we know about. The mangrove swamps of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, coral reefs. And then we have to lessen waste into these ecosystems and make degradational activities much less, because we want to preserve this thing. But the good news is who does it and how it's going to be done. So the hotspots also include world desert nations like Morocco, all of North Africa, and places where there is an ocean coast or a river coast or a lake coast next to a desert. I wanted to show you one thing to bring a little science into this. The carbon dioxide, which they're now so hotly debating at COP, goes into the world's oceans. This is the world's oceans at the Arctic and at the Antarctic. The blue is the carbon dioxide going into the world's oceans, and it goes down underneath the ocean and it comes up in the equator. That's what this red is. The equatorial Pacific and the equatorial Atlantic and the equatorial Indian Ocean. And then Coriolis force pushes this over to the continents. So this carbon dioxide is pushed in dissolved form over here to Southeast Asia. Here's a map of Southeast Asia: Borneo, Vietnam, Thailand, China is up here, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Australia, Indonesia. There's a hydrostatic head of 0.5 meter between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean that forces this dissolved oxygen to come between all these islands created by volcanic eruptions over through these very shallow platforms. What makes it shallow? There's a plate that has separated hundreds of millions of years ago from the tip of South America, and it has gone all the way over and bumped into the Asian plates, as did Australia. And then a lot of volcanic activity has occurred along the edges. And this makes hundreds of islands in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. And this very shallow platform is what the water flows over. And this makes a fabulous amount of dissolved oxygen. This is called the Darwin line. And people have thought that there's so many species and so much differentiation of life here, but perhaps it's because it has so much good dissolved oxygen and it's so much more productive than other places. But this is definitely a hot spot. And another so these are the carbon sequestered values that I have found with teams of people in 2019, and here in the Gulf of Mexico in 2019, and in the Southeast Asia in 2020. And the Gulf of Mexico has a similar, comes from the equatorial Atlantic, and it goes up through the Yucatan Straits around Florida and becomes the Gulf Stream. And the rest of that current goes around through the Gulf of Mexico and joins it. But meanwhile, there's a huge amount of dissolved oxygen here as the equatorial current hits the mainland and drops its, and this shows you the inside of the Gulf of Mexico. There are no volcanic islands. There's no plate that's moving around there. So it's only the shoreline that's very, very prolific. So here are the values, and you see that these islands that are bathed in all this dissolved carbon dioxide are the very, very fertile ones. For Indonesia, for instance, has 2,553 teragrams. One vulture says to the other, time for action. We move from talk. COP 26 is talking. So our essential steps is to convince each person that they have an effect on the world. They consume oxygen, they use water, they eat either plants or animals, they move soil. That's very important for people to see that they are a part of a web of life. They are not masters. They do not have dominion. I think the important thing is to have large-scale plans. As far as I can see, it's important that somebody take complete control for the large-scale plan. The only one that I can see that has enough expertise, enough experience, is Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which has already taken important big ideas and given them to the forestry people, given them to the fisheries people, given them to the marine people, and the lake and river people. So I think it's very important that a responsible agency begins the planning, and we have to pick the places out very carefully. And then the region is trained in what has to be done. The nations are trained one by one by skilled trainers. And then a lot of the work is going to be done by unskilled people and hired people and volunteers and people like students of science, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and there'll be a lot of employment because this is massive hand planting as well as agriculture acts. The scientists must choose where they will go, but there could be a large-scale initiation of restoration acts, which will have government stewards. They will put these parts aside that have been restored. And then there have to be funders. The funders can come from business, commerce, industry, government, private sector, and stakeholders such as all the environmental groups, conservation groups, and the political leaders, of course, have to agree to this. But they may do so because there's so many jobs for the unemployed. But the scientists have to oversee, and the scientists have to continually evaluate the outcomes, because this will be a work in progress, so that after we do the first so many millions of hectares, we know where to do the next group because we know it's successful. So here is an action. Restore 50 million hectares of forest. Tropical forest, half of that. Temperate forests, a third of that. The rest, boreal forests, which are much more expensive and difficult. Tundra, 5 million hectares. Grasslands, 16 million hectares. Marshes, 5 million. Mangroves, 7 million. Coral reefs, 7 million. Seagrass, 6 million. And seaweed, 3.5. How much is that going to cost? It's going to cost $250 billion, 245 billion. How do I come to those numbers? When you do something on large scale, such as plant 200 square miles of forest, you come to a much lower cost than if you're planting 10 meters of forest. And I get these numbers from the large scale plantings. So terrestrial forest, depending where you are and what species you're planting, but you're going to plant mixed deciduous forest, is 1,500 to 4,500 per hectare. Tundra is about 3,000. Grassland's very cheap because you go in with big farming equipment for $150 per hectare. Marine forests, which are mangroves, 2,200 per hectare. Marshes, 1,600. Seagrasses, 2,100. Coral reefs, 2,500. Seaweeds, 1,000. Now, in comparison to this $250 billion, NATO spends almost $1 trillion, 987 billion, for its annual budget, of which the US gives 685, and Canada and all other NATO countries give 302. France's military budget is 50 billion. Germany's is 4.2. So you see, this is not in a major problem like we have. This is not a huge amount of money. This is the kind of thing that EU and North America talks about all the time. The positive messages: if we regenerate the nearshore marine, what are we going to get? I'll give you one very positive message. Seaweed was brought in to be cultivated by two people, one in China, Dr. Cheng, and one in Hawaii, Max Doty. They brought these techniques in to the Chinese people and to the Filipino and Southeast Asia people. Now, the mariculture of seaweed is 5 times more than the mariculture of shrimp, crabs, and all the fish that they're doing in Southeast Asia, and Indonesia, as an example, because it's the biggest country, does the most mariculture. Seaweed is 5 times more than all the animal produce. Over a period of 15 years, it's grown from nothing to 5 times the productivity. So this can and should be done. Increase mariculture and aquaculture in a rational way, and restoration of coral reefs. There's some of the hard questions that when you look at global regeneration, you have to ask is, can we afford to allow the ecosystems to degrade as they are while we pursue financial goals and accumulate substantial assets and things? And since we have the techniques of restoration, what prevents a rebellion of the willing? That is, the willing find funders using the techniques that are now extant in the scientific world and the world of regeneration, and just starts doing it. This is what happens when you get to an oil spill. Nobody's standing there saying, you go measure the things over here, you go measure. It's such chaos, the way the world is now, that everybody just takes their buckets and their measuring devices and goes and picks out something and starts measuring the oil effects. So this may be the way the world is now. Are we a rebellion of the willing in terms of regeneration? And the next question is a very important one. Are there ways to teach people what their role and place in the web of life is? How can we get the outreach people, the teachers? And one way is for them to participate, put their hands in the ground, feel what it's like to plant something, and then come back and know that that thing you planted is growing. My greatest joy is to go on to Google Earth and zoom around the world and see all the places I've planted, and I can actually go down and see their aerial photograph. And it's a very good way to pick myself up. But there's simple fixes. Eat lower on the food chain, especially eat maricultured products like seaweed, eat throughput things like eggs, milk, maple syrup, berries. We have this strange animal in Florida, stone crab, delicious. You pull one leg off, throw the crab back in the ocean. It grows another leg. Wouldn't that be nice if our geneticists could do chickens and cows like that, where we could pull a leg off and then let the rest of it. Eat fewer water consumptive products, plant and restore native species. How many of you have xerophytic plants in your gardens, lawns? That is natural plants to the location where you are. Hard actions. Evaluate your life as to the cost benefit of where you are, what space you're taking up, what kind of livestock you use, what kind of food products you use. And let us all get behind Ada and Heitor in Brazil and their students at the university and stop 91% conversion rate of Brazil's tropical forests, which are some of the most important in the world. But what can each of us do? Where do we go from here? What kind of funders, what kind of grand plans? Can we go someplace? And I have to, at the end, thank my group in the Gulf of Mexico for the data I showed you on the carbon dioxide, where we're trying to lower the temperature in an area that has 25% of the world's, at least the United States and North America's fossil fuel generation, and then all of my colleagues in Southeast Asia. So John, thank you all for listening to this and listening to my passion, which is of course very rebellious. And John was kind enough to say that he was going to lead the discussion. So I turn it over to you, John.
Thank you, Anitra. If you could stop your screen share, then we'll be able to see each other as we speak. There we go. So I'm sure where you are, you'd like to just stand up and applaud, but thank you, Anitra, for a remarkable challenge, a challenge based on a life lived with such focus and such belief and such passion for regeneration. We're going to have a little conversation, Anitra and I, just for a few minutes, and then we'll take some of the questions. I think, Marilyn, your question's already been answered by Anitra in her follow-up slides. But Anitra, I think what is intriguing is, obviously, if you take a kind of four design principles are, is it desirable? Then the message you're calling for is desirable without doubt. Is it ethical? It's certainly ethical. And then if you look at it, is it feasible and is it viable? And it seems to me that the testimony of your life tells us it's feasible, that regeneration at scale is feasible. And the question I've always had is it viable? So I wonder if you would just really go back to that $250 billion. Is that something we can hold on to, that it's as simple as that? I know your government is currently thinking of spending trillions of dollars in different ways. And so $250 billion doesn't sound like something that's going to break the bank. And yet it always feels like it's too big an ask. Maybe you'd like to make a few more comments on that.
So is it viable? We have, in each one of these types of restorations, we have a great deal of viability success stories, and we can take you to forest after forest that have been regenerated with diverse species, and we can take you to mangrove swamps, which is what's behind me on this photograph in Oman, who came late to the party, and we can take you to coral reefs regenerated. So in terms of on the ground viability, that's one thing. But in terms of countries that decide they will now spend a lot of money and time and energy regenerating, that is not happening on a large scale. What is happening is that they're asking industries or commerce, who is taking away from the ecosystems, to put back in some place of their choosing, rather than the best place to put them back, a piece, and then they define it with dollars and cents. But you can't do that if you have to put back a huge forest that was burned down, or one that was chopped up 150 years ago for lumber, for ships. You need to really redo the whole thing, even if it means many people coming in there and redoing it. So yes, I think it's totally viable, but it's been viable in small little chunks, and that isn't good enough, and it isn't fast enough for what the people who are the atmospheric scientists tell us is a time scale of heating up the world and getting rid of the glaciers, and then having sea level rise and all these other places. So we're under several constraints that have time. But if you had more people, you could restore more forest. If you had more divers, you could restore more coral reefs. Does that answer what you're looking for?
Yes, thank you. I think one of the things that you've shared with me many times in terms of me gaining perspective on some of my issues is the zoom in, zoom out capacity. And you've once again demonstrated through your presentation of how you have such specific vision of the fish popping out behind each strand of seaweed, which is that very micro space. And then you can extrapolate that back up to the global view. So thank you for that reminder again, that the solution is to be found in the micro, but the scaling solution, we have to find ways of taking that in the zoom out macro. And you also referenced the tension between the historical view of man's entitlement to have dominion. And you asked us the rhetorical question, can we afford not to? And obviously the answer is we can't afford not to. How are we going to leverage the change? You've given us affordable figures. We can see it's viable. We can see it's it's doable. But how do you see the leveraging coming? And what inhibits these possibilities? What do you think? Is it just our thinking? Is it a fixed mindset on our part, or are there some more obvious inhibitors to the possibility for leveraging change?
I think it's very important to start where you're starting, where children are forming their morality and their consciousness of the world and their consciousness of being a player in the world or a person who's affecting the world, and get these high school students and college students active in this, because once you have been active and seen how your own activities can create a small little thicket, if not a forest, just a little group of trees, and how your own activities can help reverse a coral reef or help put a lot of mangroves along that shoreline, which then won't erode away when a typhoon comes. And everybody associated with that high school student, as you say, when you give them the consciousness and give them the math and science education, their whole group of network, mothers, sisters, aunts and uncles, people in their village, will begin to understand that that student or that child has done something really good and maybe volunteered to come back. I mean, that's on a micro scale, that there could be lots of little nodes of people who do this thing. But how it's viable in a larger scale, I think, is through convincing a certain number of politicians who may have some sensitivity to the environment because they're fishermen, they're hunters, they're whatever. They just own 40 acres of forest or something, and get them and some of the philanthropic funders to begin this thing. All you need are 5 or 6 countries scattered around in different continents, someplace in Asia. Unfortunately, Bhutan is not on the ocean, but it has forests, and I'm sure it has forests that have been degraded. And some of the island countries are particularly sensitive of this because sea level rise is really playing havoc in the South Pacific. So any of the island nations are going to be sensitive.
Thank
Does
you.
that?
Yeah, I think it's obviously an ongoing conversation, but you've made it very clear that there is a practical level of entry and there's an advocacy level, and we need to do both. Get as many people planting. And I know from my own experience that when a child plants a plant and sees it grow, the values get internalized in that process. No amount of teaching that creates internalized values. They remain extrinsic, they remain outside of me. I have to find motivation for my action. But once I understand what growing something is, my life changes. Carlos and then Julia.
Yes, thank you so much, Anitra, for your presentation and for all the immense work which is behind the presentation. You know, all you have done along these years, because this is a presentation, but it's also something which shows so much effort and passion you have put in this. I love the presentation, and I think the first graph you put in the presentation is particularly revealing. You know, this one, in which you show degenerative, degradative systems, sustainability in the middle, then restorative, and then regenerative. And this brings me to the point of thinking about what you are proposing and how this should be framed, because what you are proposing is more of a restorative nature, but we will not get it unless we go for the whole journey to regenerative. As you say very well in that graph, it's humans doing things to nature, even positive things to nature. Regenerative is humans acting as nature, which is a big mental shift. So it's not surprising to me that the cost of restoration in terms compared to many other economic magnitudes is not so high. We have the same situation, you know, with all the efforts regarding tackling climate change and so on and so on. The big issue and the trick here is that, so the issue is not that we need a huge amount of money to do restoration activity. The issue is that we can still make that and continue devoting 95 or 99% of our efforts in destructive activities, in degenerative activities, and those restorative activities will not be enough. If will not be enough, we can balance a little bit the imbalance we have, but the real thing we need is to go the whole journey of using restorative activities, not as something separate. You know, we have on the most of the planet, we do terrible things, but we have some areas where we restore nature, even if they are well chosen as the hotspots you mentioned, you know. No, it's about, let's use that restorative activities as places and ways of shifting to a completely different way of relating to each other, of living, of well-being, so that they become the attractor to get us out all over the planet, out of the destructive activities. I think that's the coupling between I mean, something which can be very beneficial in the short term, because as you show very well, nature is able to regenerate very fast, provided you allow it to do so. So it could have a very visible short-term impact, but I think we have to couple that with showing that this is the way. This is the way for all of us to relate to life, to nature, to others. Because if we only do the restorative thing and we continue, most of our activity continues to be destructive, well, that might move a little bit the lines, but will ultimately will not solve the big challenge. So I like also, and also a second comment is in that process of the journey towards the really regenerative, towards humans acting as nature. While you say it's necessary for people to realize, each one of us, what we are doing, which is true, but it's at the same time a collective challenge, and in which the inequity of the situations is brutal, you know, because I mean, we cannot blame millions of people in the global south wanting to achieve some kind of material prosperity, since we have been selling them the idea that that high level of material lifestyle is necessary for well-being. That's what we have been selling them, you know? And now they want a little bit of that. So it's also about building places where a new concept of human development is really embodied not only at the level of conscious minds, but in practical ways, you know. And many of those could be from the hotspots you are looking at. Many of those contexts, we could actually learn from what the communities living there do.
Carlos, I think you've highlighted some really big things. I know we've only got about 10 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's no
Sorry.
problem. Please read the chat. There are a couple of really good questions and comments there. But we'll take in the order Julia, Ted, Marilyn, and then maybe Tom on the phone. I know he can't put his hand up, but let's ask him to make a comment too in that order. Thank you.
Shall I go next, John? Is that what you're suggesting? Sure.
Yep, Julia, then Ted, Marilyn, and then Tom.
So my question is one that I definitely don't have an answer to, and it's one that's I'd really appreciate your thoughts, Anitra, and others in the group. But you've brought up a kind of tension in my mind that is relating to the concept of measuring what matters, which was kind of how we presented the beyond GDP aspect. There is a side of that work that is about categorizing ecosystem services and natural assets, and is sometimes looking at it in terms of like the genuine progress indicator, accounting for the negative externalities. So you're basically costing what we're losing by destroying and readjusting GDP for that, which on some levels is very practical. I get that. The point where I struggle is that it's still within this framework, and you talked about dominion, man's dominion over nature. It's still within this framework of nature as being an asset, an object, a thing that exists in order to fulfill human survival. And maybe that's a pragmatic approach at this point. But just sharing a little bit from my experience of Bhutan and what many indigenous cultures say, where nature is regarded as sacred, and it's actually indivisible from human beings. Nature is not outside of us. It might lead to a different way of acting towards regeneration. So for example, in Bhutan, they've managed to, they have this policy, as I mentioned earlier, to keep at least 60% of the country under forest cover for all time. And it's at 72% now. It used to be below 60%. And that kind of commitment doesn't come just from nowhere, you know. Similarly, a ban on mountaineering above 5,000 meters was actually expanded to include a complete ban on mountaineering because felt that tourist boots trampling on the mountains was inappropriate when these mountains are the domain of spirits, of protective deities. So there's a mindset that supports government putting in policies that might otherwise people would complain about. And there are tensions. So the wildlife farmer tension in Bhutan, because animals are protected, they're not allowed to hunt them, and they encroach on farmers' crops. So they have to balance these tensions. But just to say that again, the mindset shift seems important. So my question is it helpful? What do we think about adding a value, dollar value to nature? Or should we be really championing more the intrinsic value of nature? And is there a way to bring that mindset in amidst our secular modernized world? I'm sure there's experiences you had in the seagrass and in the sea where you had a transcendent experience of nature that took you out of your scientist mindset. How can we bring that into greater awareness? And then that combination of that viewpoint would allow policymakers to be a lot harder on our consumption patterns and to put in place things to protect nature that we might otherwise complain about because it encroaches on finance or jobs or whatever. So it's a big question, but it's one that I struggle with, and I'm very curious to hear what you think.
Well,
Anitra?
I didn't have an experience. I always had that experience. I crawled into the water before I walked. I lived on Lake Michigan and they couldn't keep me out of the water. I was always in nature, with nature. So I didn't suddenly have an epiphany recreating the seagrass. I always was most comfortable there in the water with the seagrass. But anyhow, I think this is a very important problem. And the reason I put numbers on things is because you have to know how much it's going to cost. That's everybody's next question, to bring something back, something appreciable and important. And if you don't say that, then they all say, oh yes, and it's going to cost so much, it's not possible to do it. But I do think the sacredness of the thing has been lost entirely. And the sacredness has to do with us being in that whole web of life. And when you jump into that web of life, you have a different feeling than if you're the pharaoh of all things under your dominion, you know, which has been going on for 6, 7, 8, 10,000 years, having dominion over it, but instead of having it sacred. So I suppose you've got to have two different ways of approaching the various countries around the world, and some will respond, like in India, they respond to this sacredness, and the American traditional aboriginals, you know, the tribal people respond to that. So I think you may have to go for a while on the bimodal appeal, but it's all the same thing if we're trying to regenerate rather than destroy, isn't it? If one only can speak numbers and money and the other speaks spirit, then you want all those people to join you.
Anitra, could I just do a little time check with you? Because I know you wanted to
Yes.
have a hard end.
Yes. So, yes, we have a hard end, but if Ted sacrifices 2 or 3 minutes and everybody asks quick questions, we can do it, I think.
Okay.
David isn't here to give a...
No. Ted,
Yeah.
can you save your comment question to the closing? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And then let's go. I know Anitra's got an appointment that she has to get to, so if we can just ask and comment quickly, Marilyn, and then Tom, and then John.
Absolutely. I just wanted to, I thought about Barry Hughes and the amazing work he's done with modeling. And I would like to see us take all these component parts, everything that we're discussing about regeneration versus what's happening in the world, and looking, including the spiritual aspect, and put together some modeling that would help us to look at how to actualize this.
Thank you. Tom?
Yes, well, first of all, Anitra, you made my day. I've been feeling kind of down. I've had a bit, I think I may have the COVID thing. I'm going back to the doctor today. I've been immunized, but, you know, my brother and my son both got COVID after being immunized. Anyway, you got me up and my head is off the pillow. I'm inspired by all of what you had to say. And I think you've instilled even more hope. And I'm ordinarily a pretty hopeful person, but at the same time, you know, I'm amazed and absolutely frightened at not only the sacred aspect of nature and our human existence, but also the devastating aspect. You know, in California here last year, 450 million acres of forest was destroyed by fire. This year, because people were a little more prepared and able to deal with it, it was only 250 million acres. That happened in the space of 2 years. We have to figure out some other ways of dealing with this sacred nature, because sometimes sacred activities are beyond the scope of human compassion, and they are a factor. Anyway, I just wanted to add that into the thought that, you know, a lot of this, you know, the business of dealing with nature is not only unfathomable, incomprehensible, and sometimes irreconcilable. But I want to thank you for your inspiration and giving me again the thought that it is doable, and I will exit at that point to allow to close this thing down.
Thank you. No, we're going to hear from
John
John.
Richardson.
No, we've got him. We've got him. I said John before we go back to Ted. Thank you, David, for all you've shared in the chat. I'm sorry you haven't had time, airtime, but John, and then back to Ted. You're on mute. You're on mute. You're on mute, John.
So I just want to say that in addition to studying the ecology that Anitra has talked about, I think there's also a place for the skills of the ethnographic field researcher in doing, and this comes from my own work in the Lake Erie Basin for a number of years, so that we need to have those who swim in the seagrass of political decision-making and the management of sewage treatment plants and how the city function, the planning offices function. So there's a place for the ethnographic field researcher as well as for the incredibly gifted applied scientists and ecologists that Anitra has exemplified so beautifully.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Beautiful.
Carlos has made a comment about the need for mindset shift of decision makers. Back to you, Ted, for final questions, stroke comments, stroke closing.
Yeah, this will
thank
follow
you.
rather well. I think some of the most insightful things we have received from each of us is from our own empirical work. It's often very small. It's often a single community, a single ecosystem, a single pond. You got to think small. I think we've gotten our trouble by perhaps thinking big and forgetting what's real. Really, all of the success stories are local levels, at least the ones we keep running into, and where the people negotiate acceptable solutions in concert with their own values and with their understanding of the ecosystems that they have in the past lived in or are living in now. I think that the whole issue is one of trying to work everyone back to thinking about the fact that they are part of a broad system, whether it's a social, cultural, ecological one. And when they forget that, we then become open to being soldable goods to somebody who wants us to use a single metric to really foster their own goals and their own benefits. In fact, the smaller communities usually do better. And if we were to take a role in our own organization of helping compile the kinds of success stories we've got from Anitra, from Julia, from John, from each of us, we can do a lot better than trying to empirically derive lessons that we can share with other people. That just might work.
I agree.
So, Ted, thank you to everyone. I'm handing back to you to close out the meeting and to do the thank yous. Thank you.
Yes, we'd like to really thank all of you for sparing the time to come. And I think every time we learn something, and certainly learn something from each other. I think we have the ability to take this further forward. We do have critical mass of ideas. We are really fostering the sharing of building blocks. And I know that we've talked a little bit amongst some of us about where do we go next. Anitra has managed to arrange who is coming next. Anitra, there's 2 or 3 more on the menu.
Yes, Herbie is going to be talking, and John, Tom Powers and Marilyn. Marilyn is in late January, and Tom Powers is in early January. Herbie is in early December.
So at some point in the next few months, we may actually have the opportunity to try and put something together where we can share it more broadly. Right now, it's still a lot of really good ideas, somewhat unsorted. And I think that if anyone wants to suggest where we go next, we're still open because this is an evolving initiative. I think right now it's got value on its own, but it can in fact have much more. So I'm going to end by saying that we will be coming back to you to ask for more. We will be asking for collaboration in creating something greater than the sum of our parts. And I'll leave you at that because I just told you everything I know. So I will now cut off the recording and we can then chat further should we wish.